Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandy NP. Each episode will bring you a new topic or interview related to brain health and wellness as part of my mission to help you on the path to a healthier, happier brain. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. My guest today is Angie Berrett. Angie is an intuitive movement coach, advanced trauma informed yoga instructor, registered nurse, and stand-up paddleboard yoga instructor who understands the human body and how it works. She helps people use play and movement to connect to their bodies, releasing limiting negative self-beliefs, stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma. On her own healing journey from child abuse, discovering playful ways of using movements helped her learn to listen to her body, overcoming her suffering in ways traditional modalities could not. Now she helps others heal their pain, transforming their lives. She is the owner and creator of Angie Berrett Movement, coaching people how to release stored trauma in their bodies while increasing energy, strength, and flexibility. Thank you for being here, Angie.
Mandy, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and as I talked about before the show, this is Nurses Week, so great time to have a registered nurse on. Thank you for being here this week. I always like to hear people's backstory a little bit, so we got a little hints of it in the introduction, but what brought you to where you are now?
Yeah. So, yes, happy Nurses Week, everybody that's a nurse that's out there listening. So what brought me to this, my story's sort of convoluted. I am a child abuse survivor. My abuse started when I was very young and it went for many years. And my abuse was so significant that I actually blocked out memories of it. I had no memory of it. So I grew up, I got married an abusive partner. And, as people tend to do when we have unresolved trauma from childhood, we continue that pattern. And I was lucky that I was able to graduate college, and I graduated as a registered nurse. So I've been a nurse for 20 years. And most of my experience has been in high acuity settings, emergency departments, ICUs. I thrived on chaos. And it was interesting. Working as a nurse in those environments created more trauma for me, especially the emergency department. It was always, you never knew what was coming. And yet that was the only place I felt comfortable. When I went to environments that were more calm, more soothing, didn't have quite that level of anxiety, I didn't feel safe. And I never quite knew why. And then I progressed. I ended up divorcing my husband and started on a journey to heal from the abusive marriage. Still had no memory of my child abuse. And then about 9 years ago, I was dating someone who ended up cheating on me and let me know through Facebook that they were now with somebody else. And so I laugh because that's a trauma response for me. So that betrayal by my partner unlocked the memories of my child abuse. So I started dealing with dueling traumas. And my abuse happened. It happened at church. It happened by friends of my parents. And it was people who were supposed to love and care about me. And so my partner, who was supposed to love and care about me, betraying me in such a horrific way, unlocked the memories of the friends of my parents betraying me in such a horrific way. So I started dealing with dueling traumas, and I went into a really dark place. And I like I said, I was in a really dark place. I ended up actually checking myself into an inpatient psychiatric unit because I was not safe to myself. And I just didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. I felt like I was in this pit of despair. And so that started my journey towards really healing and unlocking this, what I've always called my black hole of pain that I've carried inside of me. The reason that I felt so much more comfortable in chaotic environments, learning that I had grown up in such an abusive, high anxiety, traumatic environment. So as I've been on my journey to heal, nursing actually became too much for me. I had to take a break from nursing. The chaos, the caring for others, I could hardly handle caring for myself, and I couldn't handle caring for anyone else. So I took a break from nursing, and I knew I needed something to do to keep my mind and my body active. And I've practiced yoga for years. I've been a yoga practitioner, and it's actually interesting. I had to stop doing yoga because yoga became too overwhelming for my body. But I decided to take a yoga teacher training. I could teach yoga, I just couldn't actually be a student because it allowed me to separate from the sensory experiences that came up when I would do a yoga class. So I became a yoga instructor, loved it, started teaching yoga. I loved being able to work with people proactively rather than reactively when they came to me in the emergency department or the ICU. And things are going great. And then COVID hit, and that changed everything, brought up a lot of trauma for me and for others. Obviously, we all experienced kind of a collective trauma with that. And a friend of mine who knew that I had PTSD told me she was going to take an online trauma informed yoga training class and asked if I wanted to take it with her. And so I did, and I loved it. Trauma informed yoga is different than traditional yoga in many ways. And it allowed me to start practicing a mind-body practice again. Traditional yoga was too overwhelming and put me into sensory overload and overwhelm, whereas trauma-informed yoga and learning how to teach it and actually practicing it became a way for me to connect to my body again. And so continuing on, I did a bunch of training through trauma-informed yoga. So I'm advanced trained in that. And one of the lessons that we learned is how powerful play is in helping us tap into a part of our nervous system that allows us to feel safe. And so we started playing, and it became this act of, rewiring our nervous system. And it's interesting that around the same time, so almost simultaneously, I was doing a protocol with my therapist. I've been in intensive therapy for a long time to heal from my child abuse. And I was doing a protocol with my therapist that's designed for children who experience trauma at a young age and have no semblance of safety. When children experience trauma from such a young age, they don't have any idea what safety means, which is partially why I thrived in the emergency department for so long, because chaos is what I knew. So this protocol that's designed for young children, I learned that all mammals, humans are mammals, by the way, were born with our brains pre-wired with 7 circuits. So we come out knowing 7 things. Our brains are already pre-wired for that. And play happens to be one of those things. So if you learn how babies learn, or if you think about how babies learn or how puppies learn, they play. They play to learn how to navigate their environment. And so I was learning about how powerful play is in these 2 very separate, different arenas. And so I started playing, going back to pretending like I was a child and playing. I didn't get to really experience childhood play because I always had this heavy overwhelm of this horrific abuse that I was experiencing. And so I started learning play. I learned how to play. And what I mean by that is, for example, one of the negative beliefs that I carry is that I have to be small in order to be safe. And so I pretended like I was an elephant. I would stomp around my house. And so I got to feel the sensation of being big without having the mental story associated with being big isn't safe because I was an elephant and I got to pretend. And so as I started exploring that and playing around, pun intended, playing around with that in my body, it just really shifted and changed my healing trajectory. So I started telling some friends about it, and people who hadn't experienced trauma to the degree that I had, but who've had their own life experiences, and they wanted to try it. So I took them through some movement sequences, and it worked for them. And so it has evolved now to this playful movement of using movement and play and imagination and creativity to tap into our bodies in ways that let us or allow us to let go of the story associated with it to heal our nervous systems with sensory experiences.
Wow. There's so much in there that I could tap into.
So much in there. I know. Like I said, my story's kind of convoluted.
It's each thing had its place though. So
Yeah.
they led you to the things that you needed to get to in there. One of the things I wanted to kind of tap into a little bit, I've had so many other interesting guests on the show talking about trauma and how trauma affects us. And I had one on a while back, I believe it was Michelle Masters, when we were talking about kind of healing from our subconscious trauma. Because when we're children, kids, we have our sense of safety formed before we even realize it. And I think she said it was like around week or year 8 or 9, where our brain does this massive purge and it gets rid of information that we don't necessarily think we need. So we can be walking around with trauma, that the results of this trauma that we don't even remember because our brain purged that information. all it was left was this feeling of not safe, not safe.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. My therapist, I didn't know that about the 8 years old. The way that I've always thought of it, my therapist describes it as our brain marinates like a piece of meat. And so if we're marinating in stress hormones, we feel unsafe, we don't know what's happening at home, there's instability, that's what our brain marinates in and how our neurons form. So if we have that semblance of safety, children who have a more stable life, but even at that, kids can be cruel. So if somebody says something hurtful to you, you may not remember exactly what that person said, but that negative belief still carries through because that's what your brain has marinated in growing up. So that's interesting about the 8 years old. And if you combine that with this idea of we're marinating in either those stress hormones or those feel-good hormones, then that's how our brain forms under those conditions.
Yeah. So we create all these thoughts and we don't realize that they're being created. But then other things in our life are kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have that in our head already. And then we unknowingly seek out other environments that put us in that same feeling because it's comfortable to us.
Like me working in the
Mhm.
emergency department, I thrived on chaos. That was feeling calm was unsafe for me. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I had a bit of a string of that as well, and probably not to the same degree. We've had those big T's, little T's, but I had a bunch of bullying when I was a kid, and it came from people that I didn't expect. It also came from respected adults. So then I learned different patterns of not being worthy, not being trusted, that led into different relationships of mine. So it took a lot of therapy to work on some of that and realize that I wasn't that person that had the trauma happen as a child. And I didn't have to continue with that, but it takes a lot of work. It's where I really think we need to normalize mental health care like any other appointment that we go to, because that affects so many things in our body.
It does. It affects so much. So one of the things I love to talk about is the physiology or the body response with trauma. And it doesn't matter if it's trauma with the big T or trauma with the lowercase t, our body, our nervous system responds the same way. So our fight, something happens to us. It can be bullying, it can be child abuse, it can be you almost trip and fall and you break a bone. It can even be that. Our body responds to protect us. So our body starts to release stress hormones, getting us ready to fight or flight. So adrenaline, cortisol, all those things that are amping us up, getting us ready to run, to fight, or to flee. And what do we normally do as humans? We don't like to feel that. So we stuff it down. And so we just get this piled on stress hormone after stress hormone, build up after build up until eventually something's going to cause us to flip our lid, lose our control, release that. It's kind of like letting a pressure valve out. And so when we can find ways to start to release that in healthier ways, it makes it easier to sit in the discomfort of that emotion or that negative self-belief. So going back to me and my belief that I had to be small because being big wasn't safe, I wanted to peel my skin off at the thought of trying to be big. And so pretending to be an elephant stomping around my house, not only did I start to release that buildup of actual inertia, energy that our body creates, but it allowed me to feel that in a way that didn't make me want to peel my skin off. And so it's normalizing it, but it's also understanding it's our body's way of trying to protect us from whatever perceived threat or actual threat is coming at us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many layers in there that we could dig into. I am curious to know, so you couldn't do regular yoga, but the trauma informed yoga worked. Can you describe some of the differences between the two?
Absolutely. So traditional yoga is more structured. Oftentimes it depends on which type of yoga, traditional yoga you're doing. I'm making a generalization. Traditional yoga is more movement is based with the breath. So you move on an inhale, you move on an exhale. It's much more structured. Trauma-informed yoga is much more open. It's creating a space for people to experience whatever they want to experience. So an example, breath work is actually very triggering for me. When we do breath work, I get triggered and remember experiences that happened to me as a child. So flowing with the breath is actually very uncomfortable for me. So a cue with trauma-informed yoga would be flow with the breath or at whatever rhythm that you want to. So it's creating a space for an environment. It's understanding that certain poses may trigger traumas. So child's pose is a common yoga pose. It's where you are on your knees, arms are reached out, but your back is exposed. So it may be triggering for people who have had child abuse. So you would, so I would cue, my languaging would be come into child's pose, or if that's not comfortable, sit on your knees, take whatever pose does feel comfortable for you. There's a lot more openness to explore. This doesn't feel good for me. It's totally fine not to do it. And oftentimes in a more traditional yoga class, it's not push, that's not the right word. It's what's your fullest expression of this pose today? Whereas trauma informed yoga is more, where do you feel this pose today? Do you feel it in your feet? If you're not feeling it in your feet, where do you feel it? Do you feel it in your legs? So it's a more sensory exploration rather than a full expression of the pose today. It's a more, not even slowing down, because you can teach it faster, but it's a more connecting the mind and the body in asking more somatic or sensory type questions. Where do you feel it? What are you feeling? Are you feeling tension here? Are you feeling all four corners of your feet? And so it's a more exploratory rather than movement and breath driven directed practice.
Interesting. You said another word that kind of sparked something in me, the somatic part of it.
Yes.
So that's kind of a buzzword online.
Yes.
You can see all these different somatic workouts. Would trauma-informed yoga be a form of somatic exercise then?
It is. It is. So somatic experiencing is an official trademarked practice that is taught by a researcher by the name of Peter Levine. However, somatic work means anything that includes sensory stuff. So absolutely, it's more of a sensory exploration, somatic exploration. They mean they're used almost interchangeably. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Very cool. And when you talked about play in that as well, my youngest child, we brought him to play therapy for a while, and it was more working with the therapist using toys and dolls for kids when they can't get their words out. But it's almost, when you describe like walking like an elephant, it's almost kind of like that same thing when you can't get those words out, just using it differently for adults.
Yes, it is. And so using toys and artwork and all that kind of stuff is fantastic. And oftentimes I'll, if people aren't comfortable with movement, I'll work with my clients to do artwork or to do something else that's some sort of creative play. The movement piece is incredibly helpful because it's releasing that buildup of our fight or flight energy that I was talking about. So that's where the movement piece really combined with the play is so valuable. I have people ask, what if I want to play video games or things like that? And while as those are great and can bring out some creativity, especially if you're not using the violent ones, because that can create trauma. Video games or things where you're not actually connecting the mind and the body don't have the same benefit. So that's where the mind and body movement connection piece is so important with play. But playing with dolls, artwork, that kind of stuff, absolutely. Anything that allows you to start to experience those sensations in ways that feel safe.
Very cool. Very cool. So we've talked about the yoga. We've talked about some of those movements. What is intuitive movement then?
Yeah. So intuitive movement is learning to listen to the cues that your body is giving you. So researchers, and I don't know how they've determined this, but researchers have determined that our body is gathering sensory information and sending it to our brain at a rate of 11 million bits of information per second. Guess how much our subconscious brain can process of that 11 million? Take a guess.
I'd say maybe a quarter of it.
50 bits of information per second. So not even a quarter, like 0.00046%. So our conscious brain is unable, did I say subconscious? Our conscious brain can only process 50 bits of information. So we have all this sensory information that's going to our brain that we're not able to process, which is oftentimes why we feel kind of this angsty, emotional itchiness, and we don't really know why. So intuitive movement is using movement to learn to tap into more of that sensory information that our body is sending us. So I love examples. It's always fun to talk in the abstract, but to actually give examples, I'm going to invite you to, you can do this seated or standing, to just start with a side to side sway. So just start, I'm going to invite you, just come side to side and start to notice what's happening in your body as you do the side to side sway. So notice what's happening with your toes, maybe your shoulders, and you can make it as big or as little as you want, just noticing what it feels like to you. Check in with your toes, your gut. A lot of times our gut tightens when we feel tension. Now I'm going to invite you to go front to back and start to notice what happens when you go front to back. Mandy, I don't know if you noticed, but your jaw just tightened, your shoulders went up. So we all have one direction that feels more soothing to us than the other. So our nervous systems like things that are rhythmic and repetitive. For me, and Mandy, it looks like for you, side to side is more soothing. However, the front to back is also still information. So the direction that feels uncomfortable, because it starts to tell you what it feels like when you're feeling discomfort. So for me, I'm going to invite you to go the direction that feels uncomfortable, knowing that it feels uncomfortable. Notice what happens. My toes start to really press into the ground. My gut tightens, my back tightens, my shoulders clench. And so now go back to the direction that feels more soothing to you and notice how that feels. Notice the difference in your body.
So feel that release of tension.
Yeah, like almost a wave ripple down through you. Yeah. And so it's intuitive movement is using movement in ways, so front to back, side to side, exploring even the direction that feels uncomfortable, because you start to recognize those signs that your body's going into stress or into tension earlier. And then you can switch and go to the direction that feels that soothing wave or ripple. And relax your body. And so you start to notice earlier and earlier that you're going into overwhelm or stress or shutdown. And then you have something that you can do that'll bring you instantly right out of it. And so intuitive movement is using movement to learn to recognize those signals that your body is sending, some of those 11 million bits of information per second, and then to do something to help shift out of that when you're in tension.
So it's funny that you did that. When I noticed myself swaying a lot, like I used to sway all the time, carrying with when the babies were little, right?
Yeah.
And I still find myself doing that movement sometimes, and I can't figure out why. And I wonder if it's because I'm a little stressed and my body's just trying to release it because that's comfortable.
So explore that. And absolutely the swaying, it generally comes up when I talk about that. Yeah, it reminds us of, so think of how we comfort babies. We soothe them, right? Side to side. Some people front to back is more soothing and it reminds them of being rocked in a rocking chair. But we have the same nervous systems that we do as babies. And so that soothing motion or side to side sway or front to back sway, whatever it is finding that kind of primal childhood tapping into our nervous system to self-soothe. Oftentimes you notice people who are neurodivergent will do self-soothing behaviors. And it's for people who are non-neurodivergent, we still have the same nervous systems. We just don't have the ability or always recognize that tapping into those self-soothing movements are actually really beneficial. Absolutely. Yep. Swaying side to side, front to back, whatever works for you. I do it everywhere. I notice I do it standing in line at the grocery store now, just because that gives me anxiety. But things that give me anxiety, my body, I've trained it to now go into that side to side sway because I notice that it settles my body down. And that's now one of, for me, the first indications that I'm feeling anxious is that I am doing the side to side sway. And then I can go back and start to pick apart what's making me feel so anxious or whatever's going on.
Yeah. Yep. It's interesting when you find like little similarities between different types of therapy as well. So I was in a car accident last year. It had massive PTSD from the accident that I've been working on with a therapist doing EMDR.
Yes.
So we go into the discomfort to get rid of those feelings and sense where your body is. And then we have this mental safe space that we go to. So we go into the trauma, we go into the safe space, and it sounds a lot like this intuitive movement, finding what it feels like when you're uncomfortable, and then going back to that comfort area to bring your body quiet again.
Do you know what's interesting? I do EMDR for my PTSD as well. And that is some of what inspired the way that I guide people through movement is the process that I've done with EMDR, is to find that safe space, that safe movement. And that's also a trauma informed yoga technique, is you need to give people's nervous systems, you go into it, activation, and then you need to soothe out of it. So it mimics life, the ups and downs of how our nervous systems function, but we need to have that rest, that comfort, that soothing period. Absolutely. So I yes, EMDR is some of what I have taken to combine into the way that I work with clients.
That's awesome. I love how those things connect, and I love when my brain actually can think about it. So put those connections together.
Yes, yes.
So for our listeners, is there anything that they can do right now? Like maybe thinking about those movements, or what can they do right now to start that connection with their brain and their body?
Biggest one is starting to explore the side to side and front to back sway and noticing what feels comfortable to you, and what feels uncomfortable and what those uncomfortable feelings feel like. Another move that I love to recommend to people, if you want to take it a step further and then add some play element into it, is when you're doing the side to side and the front to back, imagine that you're a tree swaying in the wind. And so as you start to do the front to back, notice how as you add that element of imagining that you're just a tree swaying in the wind, and so you get to move all directions, notice how that changes the front to back, or the discomfort, the uncomfortable direction. Notice how, as you ground your feet into the ground, do you stand a little bit taller? And so adding this element of imagination and creativity and pretending that you're a tree can change some of that discomfort. So it gives it you can make maybe sometimes bigger movements or things like that. And so exploring, adding some creativity. Maybe a tree doesn't resonate with you. Maybe you want to imagine that you're floating in the water. I love the water. So imagining that you're floating in the water makes it much easier to tap into the sensations of feeling that. If you're scared of it, a lot of people have fear and terror of the water. Totally great. Imagine that you're a bird floating in the air. And so adding that element of play and imagination even can soothe the nervous system a little bit more. And so it's starting to explore, how does that feel in your body? Where are you feeling things? Where are you not feeling things? That's actually a pretty big clue for us. We don't feel things in certain places because we're disconnected from it. And so starting to notice, maybe I don't feel things. I have a blockage behind my left shoulder. I carry a lot of trauma behind my left shoulder blade, so I don't feel things there. And so notice, are there places where you don't feel things? So it's starting to ask these questions to yourself, but in a way that feels soothing and safe. So pretending you're a tree or in the water or a bird, those kinds of things make it easier to tap into the sensations of what's coming up or what's not coming up, and then starting to connect to that.
Very cool. I love how you're able to just switch it for whatever sensation people might have. That's really good. I think you and I could probably talk all day long on this.
Absolutely.
For sake of time wise, do you have any upcoming projects or things that you'd like to share with our listeners, for other ways that can connect to you?
Yeah, so I do 2 free master classes a month. Where we delve deeper into this mind-body play connection. And the best way to find out when those are and when that works for your schedule is through my website, angieberrettmovement.com. And I spell my last name Berrett. So I do spell it a little bit differently. So it's angieberrettmovement.com. And you can reach me. All my social medias are there, my email, my phone number. And I even have a free short, less than 5-minute movement sequence that you can do when you're feeling overwhelmed and like you're going to flip your lid. So you can find the schedule of my free master classes. All of that is on my website.
Awesome. And I will include all of those links and everything for people that are driving and listening, so in case they can't write it down, so they can find you easily. Those will be in the show notes for the show. Very good. Any last bits of information that you wanted to share with our listeners as we close?
The one thing I'd love to share is healing doesn't have to be heavy. It can be, and there's a lot of trauma that we have in this world, and rewiring, retraining our brains can be so overwhelming oftentimes, and it doesn't always have to be heavy. Play and fun and laughter are some of the best ways that we get to connect to ourselves in order to heal. And so it doesn't have to be heavy.
That's a really good thought, because I think some people are scared of it because of that.
Yes.
So very good. Thank you so much for being here today, Angie.
Oh, Mandy, thanks so much for having me.
Yes. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this with others to help me continue on with my mission to help people live healthier, happier lives. Go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to see what I'm up to and get links to all the social medias there. See you next time.